All right, welcome everybody to this special edition of Beyond Geopolitics, where I am very happy to be joined by Rising Tide Foundation President Cynthia Chung, who has an incredible Substack known as Through a Glass Darkly, and has recently begun publishing a series of essays on the title of The Real Agenda Behind Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland. Part one and part two are already up. We're trying something a little bit different here. Cynthia and I, we talk about a lot of these ideas, geopolitical, broader, conceptual, on a regular basis. And we keep on getting messages from our readers asking us to do a little bit more together. And it's true. We were talking like we don't really do these sorts of public engagements nearly as much. And so we're hoping to make this a more regular thing. And your two-part series of an ongoing series, both are published, both are free to read on your Substack, are a really good spark plug to get that conversation going. And of course, we're hoping that people are inspired by this conversation, by what they're going to experience today, to do the heavier lifting of reading through this challenging but very, very rewarding piece of research that you have published and are continuing to publish. The first one, Cynthia, you've chosen to subtitle, "This is not about liberating oppressed peoples. It is about establishing global maritime supremacy and a chokehold on world trade." That's the subtitle of part one, with a brilliant picture that you found of an octopus sitting on top of a map floating at sea with a military vessel in the background, which does in many ways paint the picture, metaphorically, of what we're currently facing. So there's a lot of confusion right now. Obviously, people are abuzz about bombs dropping on Middle East, on Iran. Where is that going to go? How is that tied to what's happening in the North American and broader Americas with the new security doctrine that was made public in December of 2025 by the United States? And you have a particularly interesting and I think a relatively unique analysis that I think deserves sharing. So maybe you could just take us through, in your article, how you're looking at the current strategy. What is the current paradigm, goals, and plans behind some of the words that are being said openly? What is the intention?
Sure. I'll just share screen here because this is going to go through a lot of graphs, which might sound scary at first, but actually, I think that they're going to help a lot with our ability to understand and neatly summarize some of the results, even with the 2025 tariffs, which should not be abstract for anyone at this point. They shouldn't be hypotheticals. We now have, some very concrete statistics to show for how these 2025 tariffs have actually resulted in terms of benefiting or not benefiting, and who are they benefiting, sort of thing, of the American economy. So yeah, this paper, I wrote actually another paper a few months back when there was a lot of uproar over the Panama ports. And these two Panama ports that were Chinese owned, it was a CK Hutchison, a Hong Kong based company. And they owned in total 53 ports all around the world. 10 ports are located in the territory of China. And so Trump was making a big deal about these Panama ports, even though they were not the only ports, by the way, in Panama, and acting like the Chinese were somehow causing issues and blocking trade, global trade, but especially American trade from going through these ports. So I ended up finding out that, the purchaser for these ports, which Trump was also supportive of, was BlackRock, which should be concerning for people because this isn't, Trump saying that the ports should, for whatever reason he wants to justify, be American ports or even Panamanian ports. This is a private company that manages the assets of billionaires. Right. And so in this article that I had written a few months ago, I go over how, BlackRock is presently managing these billionaire assets by they manage about $11.2 trillion right now. And they're buying up infrastructure from around the world. So airports, ports, certain kinds of infrastructure that, you know, you would think that the government or the country would own typically. And so there's an issue that's going on right now where they're especially focusing on buying up ports. And I'll go into the strategic reasons for why that is in a bit. But part of the Hutchison deal that was also very controversial for China was that they also wanted to buy up another 41 ports that were located all around the world. So here is actually a picture of the 53 ports that CK Hutchison owned. Mm-hmm. And from my understanding, the deal is blocked. It's just the Panama ports that were recently seized that are now in the jurisdiction of pretty much American influence. But if you look at these maps, these show where the ports are located. So this would have been a very strategic buyout from BlackRock. And BlackRock was officially brought in by the Biden administration. It's also common for Goldman Sachs people to be brought in to manage U.S. administrations. And they were specifically brought into the Build Back Better partnership, which was to directly counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. So China is working to invest in infrastructure throughout many countries in the world, and a lot of these projects connect countries, such as rail projects and so forth. So there are a lot of rail lines that are very important that are connecting Asian countries to European countries and connecting now for more and more within Africa. So I mean, these are good ideas to facilitate trade. And the issue with ports is that ports have always been a strategy of like empire, because it's a lot easier to have choke points in trade. Rail is always been the enemy of imperialistic, control, because you want artificial scarcity. You don't want regions to be able to be self-sustaining, because then you lose your ability to control those regions. So there is a clear shift right now in terms of trying to return back to a kind of maritime form of trade, which again, this will become more clear as we go further in.
Just to add one little thing here too, just for coloring of what you're saying, because China's approach of unveiling its foreign policy around this global effort for infrastructure encompassed both aspects, right? Of having a belt road concept was you had a sea-based maritime infrastructure buildup around, China ports around the world were built up pretty quickly and massively. But at the same time, it also involved an overland energy, medical, rail thrust with rail arteries that came with new industrial sectors being created, new training systems, new trade schools being built up in various countries, including within China, that were doing business with China around the BRI. And Latin America, the Americas more broadly, was not exempt. They were certainly receiving a lot of Chinese investment on both of those fronts, and the idea of the U.S., both Biden and it seems now also Trump, of looking upon China not as an opportunity to redeem ourselves and cooperate on something rational based on developing the real economy in cooperation for war avoidance and making abundance, that has been put in the dumpster and set on fire. And instead, China's been targeted, it seems, as the critical nemesis for the United States to be destroyed, which you've been pointing out in your essays, right? Around all of these strategies are all directed in various ways to try to obsessively weaken and destroy China as the dominant threat of U.S. foreign policy. I just wanted to throw that out there as a quick observation before you continue onward.
By the way, is there a way for us to show our screens and also what I'm showing? Or
there's only you, so you can do stop share and show something else if you want.
No, I mean like us.
Oh,
Show
well,
us.
right now we're both being recorded, so the recording is of you and me
Oh
and
wait,
your
here. I
screen.
can do it this way. I think that works. Yeah, and also just to note that these ports are controlled by the countries. These are not, when China helps to build an infrastructure project, the project is always under the ownership of the country. And the idea is that it's a win-win, which is a phrase that China uses because China, has made a lot of money off of export trade. And obviously, trade it benefits both sides. If you're doing good business with good business measures, like it's a win-win. And the problem with what has been controlling the world for too long, and what has really hindered the momentum that we saw coming out of the late 1800s, where the American system was being developed, in Germany with the Friedrichs Zollverein, or the economic the American influence in Russia with the Trans-Siberian Rail, and the Meiji Restoration in Japan, and Sun Yat-sen, doing a tipping of the hat to Lincoln and the principles of the people. Like, these were clearly economic concepts that were really spreading, and it was about building up an infrastructure, a machine tool industry to increase the standard of living and the welfare of the people. But it also allowed for the independence to empire. When you're self-sustaining, which is what the United States had to fight for to free themselves from the British Empire, when you're self-sustaining, it's harder to control you. So it's all about controlled scarcity, or artificial scarcity. And so now that China has put a lot of money into these infrastructure projects that have been hindered since the late 1800s, these are ideas that were already on the board in the late 1800s. These are old ideas. This isn't China just coming up with these plans and then people are like, thinking that there's some kind of diabolical agenda. These were plans that should have already happened, and there was a wave of assassinations to prevent it. Including Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II as well, were part of that assassination wave.
Mm-hmm.
And Lincoln, for people, he was part of the transcontinental rail and the greenback system to free the United States from a banking system that was really trying to control how loans were being given out for infrastructure projects.
Right.
So now increasingly BlackRock is in charge of billionaires. So again, there's no loyalty to a country. But more importantly, there's no loyalty to any kind of concept of the welfare of the people. So when they want to buy these things up, it's to control the avenues of trade and who gets to participate in those avenues of trade. And they can, just as the sanctioning game has been working, their idea is that if they control the avenues of trade, they can include and disinclude, I don't know if that's a word, but whatever.
Yeah, you're a poet. It's okay. You can create words.
Disinclude whoever they want to. So BlackRock, during Biden's administration, they were brought in as overseeing the rebuilding of Ukraine. There's probably, ties to this with the Gaza rebuilding too. We're seeing a lot of this kind of, creepiness around places that have been decimated, and they're going to be totally rebuilt anew by select boards governing the direction for this. So the Build Back Better was renamed because they probably realized that that sounded very odd of a name, almost an Orwellian name, to Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And some of the names that were included in this committee that also included G7 countries for how they were going to start addressing global infrastructure, which should make you wonder, why is G7, talking about global infrastructure? in the way that they are, where they're going to be basically deciding how these projects are done. Again, this is very different from China. China goes into countries, they have conversations with the government of the country. There are agreements to how things are done. They don't go in and force anyone's hand. And if people want to have a debate about that, they can read my paper, The Real Global Agenda Against China, on my Substack that I wrote a few years back. So part of this is Microsoft is also being brought heavily into this. So it's Microsoft and BlackRock who are, it seems, the lead names that are going to be, putting a lot of money into this, but they're also going to be directing the kind of digital infrastructure, cybersecurity, skilling that is going to be happening in countries that allow them inside.
Right. You pointed out there Kenya, Indonesia, Malaysia is just three examples with Thailand and the Philippines, where BlackRock and Microsoft are given responsibilities for building up something which is part of this panopticon technocracy. So that's also an interesting thing.
I know that BlackRock has bought a Malaysian airport already. So again, people have to realize that this is legally owned now by the billionaires who BlackRock is working for. So they can decide to do whatever they want with that airport. On that note, though, Malaysia did become recently a partner of the BRICS. So, there are some countries like the UAE as well that are kind of like
getting pulled between two worlds.
Yeah. So I already went through that. So if people want to know more about that, because I go through it in quite a bit of detail, but that's not the main focus I want to talk about in this this discussion, they can check out my paper, BlackRock is buying up the world's infrastructure to serve billionaire oligarchs. And that basically is it, right? We're not going to own anything. And that's the model that they want. We're not supposed to own our homes anymore. Blackstone, which is actually a partner, Larry Fink from BlackRock used to work for Blackstone. Blackstone is the largest landlord in the world, and they're buying up a bunch of houses in the United States, so that, most people who own homes right now, they're in their later years. And when those people pass away, almost assuredly, Blackstone is going to be buying up a lot of the real estate, as they already are. In some communities, already something like 27% of the houses are owned by Blackstone or a private company like Blackstone. And so increasingly, people are not going to be able to buy homes, and you're going to have to be a renter. And increasingly, they want this for cars as well. They want you to be renting everything. You don't own anything. So I'm making the point in this series that the Trump tariffs, unfortunately, were also towards this agenda of global acquisition. And I've done some very detailed papers already on my Substack this past spring, when already the red flag was waving for me on this. And those two papers are called Billionaires Make America Great Again, something very similar to that. So the reason why Trump's tariffs were about global acquisition is because he basically said it himself, right? The goal is for industries that he wants them to relocate themselves to the United States. So,
do you have any examples of what those would be?
Well, TSMC is a very big example, who is
the semiconductor.
One of the leading semiconductor producers in the world right now. They're located in Taiwan. But, Japan and South Korea are also doing a lot in tech. And Trump wants all of these kinds of tech companies, especially, to move to the United States if they want to avoid tariffs, right? The amount of costs involved in relocating are also quite high. So it isn't like a great deal, even if you're just looking at cost wise. And he also wants, factories in Europe, car factories. Volkswagen, from what I've heard, has decided to actually move to China rather than the United States. But Yeah, that was part of the global acquisition because the idea is that they see China as a threat because it's a rising economic power. And so they wanted to basically have world trade shun China. Last year was the point of the 2025 tariffs. In case it wasn't obvious, I mean, it was pretty much a very clear battle between the United States and China primarily. And a lot of countries were being given a hard time, especially on their trade relations with China. In the case of Vietnam, Navarro was very direct about it. Vietnam offered to have no tariffs against the United States because that was part of the complaining that countries dare to tariff the United States. And so Vietnam was like, well, we won't give you tariffs then. And Navarro was like, that's not good enough. We want you to stop trading with China, which is insane because if you look at East Asia is there are more people living in East Asia than the rest of the world, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a booming consumer market that will explode. It's growing exponentially.
Well, it's like it's their own backyard too, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure China must be the dominant trading partner of Vietnam, and just as much as it is most of the Asian countries in the Pacific. So to tell one of them, by the way, if you don't want to be abused and you don't want to suffer, just simply cut off all relations with the country you need the most to survive. That's right in your backyard for your trade. Just do that, and we won't hurt you. Right there, that says a lot about the intention, the perverse intention of a major power, which the fact that you pointed out that Peter Navarro himself was asserting that is quite astounding.
Yeah. I don't have the pictures memorized here, but I think I have it. Hold on. There we go. There are more people living. So East Asia is actually a massive growing hub, like Indonesia too. It's like Vietnam. They're all Thailand. These are all economies that are, already in many ways a first world status. And it's just going to explode as a market. And of course, China is in the center of all of this. And then a lot of these countries have very good trade relations, pretty much all of them do. The other issue, people need to realize, like Japan, for instance, is a good example to show how these tariffs were working in a way that was not very friendly. Japan is a very close US ally, and the United States was asking Japan to accept their GMO rice because they apparently needed to sell it somewhere and they choose Japan. But Japan has a long tradition of, being their own rice producer, and it's non-GMO. They have a higher standard. They also make their own cars that also are of a higher standard, safety-wise as well. And the United States was pushing their products as part of the trade deal. So you can see this is not about the free market, if you even believe that can possibly exist, where the best product, at the best competitive price succeeds. This is now just like strong arming, thug mafia type behavior where it's going to really mess up a lot of industries. Like you're starting to do warfare on industries that actually deserve to flourish and do well. And it's hurting the standard of living of the people who live in those countries. So these tariffs were a really bad idea.
Yeah,
Actually,
too, just quickly on that note too, right? Part of their whole thing to Japan, part of the message was if you don't want to suffer, you don't want to feel these new waves of tariffs, then not only do those things, but also put, I think it was $600 billion, correct me if I'm wrong here, into a fund that will then be administered by US billionaires who exactly, I'm not too sure, in order to invest in America. So basically put this money that you can no longer put in Japan into a fund for Western billionaires to invest in American, I don't know, making America great. Is that correct, what I just said there?
Yeah, it was, I think it's around 500 billion. And yeah, like crazy numbers. By the way, a lot of these crazy numbers that are being thrown out there, Trump has also said like Apple's going to give this much and blah, 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 blah. These are all just like pledges.
Hmm.
Nobody has come anywhere close to giving any of that kind of money, countries or companies so far. They're just pledges. So take it for what you want, for how, meaningful that is.
Hmm.
But the prime minister for Japan, up until around September or so, who was
Shiba.
Shigeru Ishiba, sorry, I can't pronounce that very well. He was actually resisting the tariffs. And that's really great because unfortunately, Japan, if you look at the history of Japan economically, Japan had actually a really strong economy, a really strong manufacturing and industrial base, and a really good banking system. And that all got messed up by American interventionism. And if they want to read more on it, they can read my paper, Is Japan Willing to Cut Its Own Throat and Sacrifice the US Pivot to Asia? Sounds harsh, but it is actually, it's really bad what the United States has constantly been asking of Japan throughout the decades, several decades, on favors to prop up the American economy. And the Plaza Accord was an absolute disaster for Japan that, again, was done as a favor to the United States. At this point, Japan's economy is on life support. And these kinds of favors are still being asked. So we have to ask ourselves, if this pretty much the top most important US ally of Asia is being treated this way, how are we really viewing what the policy is at this point? It's not just about having friends, it's about you bending the knee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all, you really can't make an argument that the way that the United States was addressing itself to Japan throughout 2025 was anything but that. So now there's a new prime minister, and that's when the pledge happened of the 500 billion. And there is a lot of upset in Japan over that. There's, I think, a split right now on the sort of thing. There's also a lot of strong arming for Japan to become the NATO of Asia, which is a really not great move for Japan with its economy not doing well. It's very reliant on trade with China. And then on top of it, it's supposed to somehow find the money to build up a military to try to fight China.
Well, yeah, Japan has built up a reputation for itself across Asia as being an immobile aircraft carrier for the United States, right? I mean, they host, I don't know how many, over 58,000 US troops. Major US military equipment is based in Japan, in the south of Japan. And it's pretty clear, like you said, a NATO of the Pacific has been sold first under Biden, still being sold currently, which would involve Australia and I guess South Korea probably, as well as probably Taiwan in a certain way, if Taiwan could be induced to fully push for a separation movement, which I know it doesn't seem possible. However, that seems to be what certain game masters want to see as far as a fully disposable.
South Korea has shown that they also are not happy with this. When Nancy Pelosi did the tour, the South Korean leader was like sick and couldn't meet with her, right?
Right.
So I think that gave a message. Of course, things are not always going to be consistent with these countries. And that was the other thing, right? Like Shinzo Abe being assassinated, I think, shows, again, if people want to know more about that, they can read the paper.
Just to say a quick word about that. Shinzo Abe, in your mind, was playing a positive role in things?
Mm-hmm. Even though there was a lot of tensions because, Japan, the Japanese fascists really did a number on the Chinese during World War II. And Abe was part of the kind of unapologetic, fascist family groupings in Japan. The issue with Abe that actually worked for security and stability in Asia was that he didn't want Japan to be a satrapy. And he wanted Japan to have a strong economy, and he didn't want Japan to be just a pawn for the United States. So he was actually found to be he wasn't prime minister at the time, but, Abe pretty much was like the guy at that point. Like, just to give you an idea, in the past 19 years, there's been 11 prime ministers. Abe served 9 of those years.
Oh.
So for 10 years, there was 10 prime ministers. Abe served for, 9 years. So Abe is like the leader, well, was the leader. And so even though he wasn't the sitting prime minister, he basically had a lot of clout, and he was doing a lot of backroom discussions between Russia, China, South Korea, which looked like they were very sane policies, because I think he saw where the wind was blowing. Because if you haven't noticed, the kind of demands that have been put on Japan would cost Japan. Like, they're going to throw Japan into the fires of war. So Abe wasn't for that. And thus he was a stabilizing factor, even though he had questionable ideologies. Yeah, so the 2025 tariffs were a failure. They were clearly prioritized on China, but China came out at the end of 2025 with an even larger trade surplus. So even though a lot was done to try to hinder China in their export trade, Scott Bessent has said there's an imbalance in exports that China has. Heaven forbid that people have access to trade from China that most of the world really needs, access to materials at this point. It showcased that China did the impossible, what Scott Bessent thought was the impossible, and replaced the US consumer base within a year. So that is horrifying, because Scott Bessent weaponized the consumer base, the US consumer base, but they also were trying to do it globally against China, and China came out trading even more. That should tell people something about how the world is dealing, because China traded with, they decreased about 25%, by 25% of their exports to the United States. And they've already started the decoupling before 2025. So that really sped up the process. That actually hurt the US manufacturing base, by the way, because they now didn't have access to a lot of products that they needed for manufacturing. And for where they could find those products, they still had to pay more, because there was a flat tariff, out for all countries, which, by the way, is a revenue tariff. It is not a protective tariff. And when Trump kept, referring to McKinley as the model for his protective tariffs, McKinley was the one who actually made it very clear that at the time, during his life, and he was president from the late 1800s to the early 1900s before he was assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt took over his dead body, which is not a coincidence, by the way. He was talking about how the Democrats were trying to push a revenue tariff, and McKinley was talking about a protective tariff. Protective tariff is selective on strategically on what goods need to have a tariff on them to help manufacturing. Other goods should not have a tariff on them to, again, help your home manufacturing base, because some of those things you will need to build up your manufacturing base. Some of those things are competing with your manufacturing base, and you want a tariff on them. If you do a flat out tariff on everything, you're just taxing people. You have a tax revenue. And so a lot of people, were not believing this. Scott Bessent kept repeating in every interview he was doing, China is going to eat the tariffs. China is going to eat the tariffs. Well, we see after the end of 2025 that the US actually decreased in exports. So China increased in exports. The US decreased in exports, increased in their imports. And they largely, were hurt because with their exports, because China was not buying from the US, they had decreased it. Here we have a graph of how much China has decreased their US imports. So this is all hurting the US economy. it did not hurt the Chinese economy. The tariffs clearly hurt the US economy and is isolating the US economy from global trade.
Yeah. Which a healthy application of the American system of tariffs, which increase the productive powers of labor in opposition to revenue tariffs that you've expounded upon eloquently in your previous essays. And maybe we should just do a full interview just on that particular topic at some point very soon. The McKinley versus Teddy Roosevelt opposing idea of tariffs that people today don't fully understand. They tend to put one blanket label on tariff as a tariff as a tariff, and they don't differentiate what you've just said and what McKinley understood as a revenue versus a real protective tariff. The real protective tariff increases the productive powers of labor, and as a by default also increases the overall surplus, the abundance at which trade can happen at a higher quality, and it doesn't hurt other countries. It never ever grows at the expense of other people's destruction. That is not a real. That's more like what I guess the British Empire was doing to its colonies, as far as forcing its colonies to eat to receive finished goods from the British Empire in order to destroy the colony's desires and aspirations for development. Am I right about that?
Yeah, well, they were enforcing free trade when they themselves were using protectionism, for one thing, but they were also doing dirty, like Henry C. Carey wrote a lot about how the British trade with Africa was not honest because they only traded with them in, alcohol and guns,
Hmm.
and they were not offering anything else. So there was a lot of dirty dealings with that, which, as you said, is, I guess,
That's a whole other conversation. Yeah.
a future
Uh,
discussion we can
yeah.
have.
So
But
what do you
yeah,
got there? What's this U.S. importers for most of the tariff costs? What is this graph?
yeah. So that's just again showcasing that we have the statistics now for the 2025 tariffs and the manufacture. So the U.S. base of manufacturers, business, and especially U.S. consumers officially ate the tariffs.
Mm.
And Scott Besson is talking about increasing the tariffs, the blanket tariffs, to 15%. I don't know if he's already done it or not, but he's talking about it. So to make it very clear for you, this is a revenue tariff. The revenue is going to the US government to use this money however they choose to. The revenue is not going to the people. The revenue is not going to the manufacturing base. It's going to the US government. The US government is collecting a tax from businesses, industries, and the US consumers. So you are being taxed extra. And a lot of this, the reason why Scott Besson is talking about increasing the blanket tariff to 15% is because they got bogged down into the Iran war and they need to raise military funds. And the economy is really not doing well. We're going to go over some graphs very quickly as to why, but people really need to be clear on this. The tariffs are not getting other people to pay for things for you. You are paying for these things. No one else is really paying for these things, like not even other countries. It's not just China. Like the countries can decide to not trade with you. So there was a little bit of arrogance. I think Scott Besson, he really knows what he's doing. So I would not think that Scott Besson is surprised, by the way, that it has turned out this way, that the US base paid for the tariffs.
Mm.
The other issue is the US dollar's strength is not doing well. Now, yes, it's good to have a weaker dollar if you want to encourage exports, but the US is actually very dependent on imports as well, again, for its manufacturing base. But also, like you have to think about a lot of the small businesses and things like you're hurting small businesses the most by doing these kinds of decisions. So it's a double-edged sword to have too weak of a dollar. The other issue is that you are not going to be able to hold a world reserve currency status with too weak of a dollar. And right now, this is what has been causing a lot of the chaos with the
Mm.
United States foreign policy is that they're freaking out because they know that they are in trouble with keeping the world reserve currency as the US dollar. And China has been not only increasing its exports to the world, but the thing, and they're asking for people to pay in their currency, the renminbi or the yuan. But also when they're buying, depending on what they're buying, they also have the ability to demand that these people are also exchanging in their own currency. So what this is doing is increasing de-dollarization by China increasingly dominating in trade and being able to dictate that people transact in their currency. It is removing the status of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. This is what has allowed the US to be put in a position where they sanction whoever they choose at the whim, the wave of a staff or whatever.
Yeah. That's a crazy graph. It's so important for people to really just take in some of these graphs that you've embedded into your article to advance your case, because it's so objective just to see the straight numbers, the straight statistics, where this one alone that you're just showing me right now features the global trade, like how many the transactions settled in US dollars versus renminbi from 2010 to 2020, end of 2024, where you could see in 2010, not that long ago, the renminbi was only used in 0.3% of global trade transactions to settle, I guess, balance of trade and other things. And 83% was US dollars. And it's been like that for a long time. And you could just see that those curves, those charts inverting completely over 25, not even 50, 16 years, to the point that now 52.9% of trade is settled in renminbi and only 42.8% is settled in US dollars. Is that right? Is it? Or is this between the USA and China specifically, or is this globally?
No, I think that this is a global.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
Oh, I mean, it wouldn't be between China and the United States because the United States wouldn't do such a thing.
Amazing.
But that's part of why the US, as we're going to get into, that's part of why the US wanted to seize Venezuelan oil, because China was a big buyer of Venezuelan oil. And they were like, well, we have Venezuelan oil now, but you can buy it.
Right. It's like more equity all of a sudden. It's like
Buy it. Like as Trump
yeah.
said, he actually said, like, we're open for business for China.
Right.
And
Right.
he even said Russia, he says they have their own oil, but you can come and buy this too. And what is he doing? He's saying that you now need to buy it in US dollars if you want it, and also pay more than you would have been paying because they were getting a discount. This is all to help the petrodollar. This is also most certainly a huge factor, not the whole reason, but a very big one of the Iran war was also the freaking out over losing the petrodollar status. Now, I think that originally they knew, and there is an interesting Tucker Carlson interview, right, with Maxime Bernier, of all people, where they both agree that the goal is to change the currency, the world currency. However, the Americans wanted to do it on their own terms, right? Like everybody can see that the system is on life support. The debt situation has gotten out of control for the United States itself, that there needs to be a kind of like reset. But they wanted to dictate the terms of the reset. However, they're panicking now because it looks like China will dictate the terms of the reset. That all the chaos that they're organizing now is really backfiring because it is pushing things towards a reset, but not the reset that they wanted, kind of thing. So that's why Trump is really unhappy with the BRICS alliance, is because the BRICS alliance is primarily directed towards trading amongst themselves in the conditions that they want to. Because, before that, there was the Western diktat of like how you're supposed to trade and the kind of conditions for trade, IMF, World Bank, as well were very interfering in what would normally be occurring in trade. So increasingly, the West, the G7, is losing its ability to dictate the kinds of terms for world trade.
Right.
That's why Trump is calling the BRICS anti-American.
Right, because part of that too is if everybody is settling their trade in U.S. dollars, if they have U.S. dollar reserves, then that is something that can be lorded over their head if you want to wield sanction, if you want to sanction a country or threaten them for not behaving the way you want to. The fact that they have your U.S. dollars makes it creates a weaponization aspect to the whole thing, I suppose, which is also something which they're breaking away from now that they're settling in local currencies and yuan instead of just being reliant upon the US dollar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's not just the Chinese renminbi that they're doing. They are also using their local currencies, like you said, amongst themselves, because it's not just like all trade with China. They're trading, the BRICS members are trading amongst themselves, they're trading with other countries. So it's to empower the global South, more broadly. And it's not just about the Chinese renminbi, although the Chinese renminbi is the one to compete with the US dollar status. So for people who might not know, BRICS members, the original was Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's why it's called BRICS. Since then, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, UAE have joined as members. And Saudi Arabia is still sitting on the fence. Indonesia joined in 2025, and we have a bunch of countries that are observers who are likely to join, including Malaysia and Thailand and Nigeria. This is a fun graph just showing the global GDP and population, oil production, and good exports, just to give people an idea that these countries really are, when BRICS was originally formed, I think in 2013, everyone was laughing at this as
Yeah,
like, oh,
I remember
like
that.
what a pathetic, attempt to challenge the status quo. And
Yeah.
now, they're shaking it in their boots. This is the GDP that BRICS has, and also projection into the future, but into like 3 years into the
That's
future.
a crazy graph. That's a wild graph. And the fact that you have China alone at 21.2% of
It
world
pretty much
GDP.
matches the G7. Yeah.
Yeah, just by and then you add everybody else on top of it. That's a really dramatic graph.
Yeah. And again, so sad that Japan is such a small section of that. And Germany too, for I just want to say a quick side note that Japan and Germany were targeted in World War II because they were leading industrial countries. And they were again considered a threat
Mm-hmm.
because and Germany was for World War I and World War II placed on the enemy side because they were becoming a real powerhouse industrially.
Mm-hmm.
This is why those nations were targeted. It wasn't a coincidence that it happened the way it did. And then when they lost World War II, they became, totally subservient to the Anglo-American diktat. To
Mm-hmm.
this day, like Germany and Japan have to turn to their masters before they can make any kind of decision in policy.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't have to be that way. So a lesson to people who think that you can get ahead by working in service to Anglo America.
I just want to add, can I add one little word too for some of the black pilled people out there who I know groan a little bit when they hear anyone speaking about the BRICS, which, I know so many people who say, oh, that's false opposition or controlled opposition. Can you still believe that the BRICS is a genuine thing? Don't you know it's created by Goldman Sachs and Jim O'Neill, who wrote the famous white paper in 2001, outlining the acronym BRIC for Brazil, Russia, India, China, later to be joined by South Africa in 2010 or 2011. And just quickly for those people, when you read Jim O'Neill, the Goldman Sachs banker's vision for what that acronym meant, all he meant was that we will lose the influence over those countries of Brazil, Russia, or yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, if we don't include them into the G7. And so he just simply was thinking about this as an extension of the already Wall Street, London controlled G7, not as a thing that could challenge the G7. It's two different concepts, even though the acronym is the same. It existed before the acronym was created. There was already this alliance of especially India, China, and Russia, which he was deployed to try to subvert because it was already happening. So I just wanted to throw that out there for, again, people listening who might be a little bit confused about this BRICS, and not to say that BRICS is all one thing that doesn't have its own internal problems and disputes and factions. That's true too, which you've written about and are continuing to write about, but it is not what Goldman Sachs wants or ever wanted.
Some members are playing both sides, like India and UAE, but I would say that the overall qualitative difference of the BRICS philosophy and also what they have physically done in terms of actions towards economic investments, economic progress, you cannot argue that it's the same because the G7 has done nothing but atrophy over the years, and East Asia is building itself up. And I'm not talking about military wise. I'm talking about they're building up their society. They're building up the living standard. They're building up the real wealth for the people. Like, China has put a lot of money, and I'm not saying it's just China, these countries overall, like it's crazy how far they're coming from, right? Because it literally was like, for a lot of these countries, shacks to now like airports that are way bigger, way more beautiful than anything we have in the West, sort of thing, like buildings that are so tall. And it's to showcase, and also the medical care is like starting to become way better than what we have here at home. The Chinese life expectancy, for instance, is now like in 81 or something, and the United States dropped from something like 78 to 76. So these are real measures for quality of living. You cannot compare what is happening there as an impetus to what is happening in G7, because G7 people are getting like sicker. They're getting worse care, worse medical care. It's more in debt. Having things taken from you that you used to own, like, for instance, even just how the house ownership situation works. I don't know about like countries, obviously countries in Europe, they all have like their different system, but largely in Canada and the United States, right? Like you get constantly taxed after you technically own your house, but you can lose your house if you don't continue with your taxes up to a certain point, right? And in China, and I don't know about other countries in East Asia, but I'm sure it's really much better of a situation, if not the same as China. You don't pay taxes. Once you own your house or your apartment, you own your apartment.
Yeah.
You could lose your job and you could not have a job for 10 years. If you can feed yourself, find a way to feed yourself and all that, your apartment and your house is always yours.
Right.
These are things that, we totally don't realize, hey, the world could actually work that way because we've been living in the Western system for so long, but it is highly immoral that is happening, that things that you actually or even like that your house is on, you can own your house, but then the property that your house is on is not yours. And there's all of these kinds of loopholes for taking your property away from you. So the laws are actually a lot better in the Asian countries to protect people's livelihood.
There's no capital gains taxes either. Like it's people. I mean, I know that a lot of people are listening to this, and well, I'm sure if people are listening to this, they're probably pretty well informed and don't have a lot of these triggers. But I know that this kind of conversation amongst many many people who consume alternative media would immediately trigger communist propaganda, CPC. But it's like, no, you can't. Those Cold War definitions don't apply in the real world that we're living in. Because I mean, to say that we're the embodiment of democracy and capitalism, when we are clearly slipping into and have been into feudalism, where people will own nothing and supposedly be happy under the veneer of capitalism, and China, which, yeah, sure, it's called the Chinese Communist Party. That's something they call themselves. But if you look at practically what they do, there's a faster growing small and medium class, a private sector which is thriving massively,
And
and
capitalism.
ownership, huh?
And capitalism.
Real
Yeah,
capitalism, yeah, that
capitalism
doesn't just like,
is working in, like, I mean, capitalism exists in a huge quantity in China. So
yeah,
it's not like there needs to be a new term, to define this economic system. Like, for instance, we call what the United States was developing under Alexander Hamilton the American system, and that was what it was called by its founders, Matthew Carey, and oh my God,
Clay,
I'm forgetting his name,
Clay.
Henry Clay. But that's like really undefined, right? Because and it's not the best name because you call it American system, and
Yeah.
then if Germany adopts it in other countries, it
Well,
sounds weird.
Friedrich List had defined. He wrote the book redefining it as the national system of political economy. I think that maybe is a little bit more universalizable.
Yeah, it's
Not
still
exactly what we want either, but it's
undefined,
still,
though. Yeah, we
yeah.
need a Leibniz kind of definition. Leibniz, for people who don't know, Gottfried Leibniz, who discovered the calculus, not Newton. He had to, like Shakespeare, would create new words to have like a definition that we didn't have. English is a pretty new language, and it is actually quite simplistic compared to a lot of older languages that are out there. That's why it's kind of the universal language as well, because it's an easy language to learn. But Leibniz would make new words up to describe the scientific thoughts and philosophies and nuggets that he was developing in his work. So I think that we're at a point where we really need to come up with a new word, because it isn't communism. Like, there are elements of communism, there are elements of capitalism. So it's not fair to say that it's like anti-capitalism, for instance. It is not. China does not function as an anti-capitalist, country.
Mhm.
And the thing is that East Asia, from my knowledge, everybody else is not communist. Like, no one else is communist. And they also have similar principles. People have to understand that the Asian people share a long history civilizationally that continues. Like,
Mhm.
for instance, South Korea has a heavy Confucian tradition. The Chinese continue also their heavy Confucian tradition. Actually, this is a bit of a side note, but since you brought it there, we watch a lot of South Korean shows and also a lot of Chinese. Well, not as many actually. I watch a lot more South Korean shows, but the interesting thing about China is that they have a lot, if not majority, like a lot of content is from the old dynasties, the old Chinese dynasties. Why do you think a communist country is focusing on the old traditions, the old civilizational philosophies and strategies and thoughts, and so forth? Like, why are they enforcing so much
Yeah.
like forms of history lessons, of deep history of Chinese civilization, if the idea of the Communist Party was to cut that out and in an Orwellian way to erase the people's minds?
Yeah, like I that's a great point. And I was thinking about like how many of these sorts of Asian shows we've been checking out, and I've not seen any of these popular shows that feature any sort of, like, in the West we have a lot of shows like Happy Days and That 70s Show and Stranger Things, and there's like a lot of these retro romanticizing the past of the Cold War period. Like, a lot of that's been going on for many, many years, right?
Mm.
And it's just everywhere in the Western propaganda matrix to get us to romanticize the type of lifestyle, the attitudes, the better days of the past. You know, those were the days. Whereas in China, nothing. I haven't found any communist settings for any of the shows we've encountered. They're either right now in the present, or they're deeply embedded in the Tang Dynasty past of 1400 years ago, or the Han Dynasty. Like, they're all these period pieces that feature these Confucian and Buddhist lessons, which is the most anathema to the radical sort of communist that wants to extract the opiate, of like traditional moralities and traditional values and religions. They want to just trash all of that. If you're true to like, you know, a true-blooded adherent of the Marxist philosophy to the extreme, you don't allow private property. You don't allow the respect for these deeper traditional things that are outside of the end of history that Marx and Engels thought they were bringing into the world with the application of their system, was sort of this new age before which nothing really matters. So yeah, great ironies for people to sit back and just to throw it out there as a challenge. If people are confused by this, the best thing to do is to read some of the literature, read some of the analects, pick up some poetry, or better yet, watch some of these shows that we've been watching and get a visceral sense of the difference of how entertainment is composed with moral lessons embedded and much more dignity embedded than we have anywhere in the options being created in our Western part of the world, as far as things that are expected to shape the identities of us here in the free and democratic rules-based order of the West. So just a challenge for those watching, and maybe check out some of the links. We'll put some links in the description box, actually. That's what I'll do. When this goes up online, there will be some homework that if people want to dig in deeper, they can go into the description box and click on some links.
Yeah, and just as a quick note, you can check out Pearl Story or The Double on Netflix, which are Chinese TV shows that we particularly thought were very well done, and for a young audience as well. The other thing too is, if you want something quicker, you can go onto YouTube and just look at Americans reacting to Red Note, and that will also give you a lot of, I think, fun, entertaining paradoxes.
Right.
Because, when Trump was trying to, I think, yeah, TikTok was like shut down for like what?
2 seconds. Yeah.
Not that long, maybe like I don't know, a month or two. But the backlash was hilarious because people, when they didn't have TikTok, they went on to China's Red Note, and China's Red Note is actually a much healthier social media platform. And that's when they started to see how China, and it's very Chinese, right? Like TikTok, the TikTok version that Americans were seeing, they weren't really seeing anything about China on it. When they went on to Red Note, when they were deprived of TikTok, they started to see how like Chinese people live, like the average person. And they were like, what the hell? Because like the restaurants are nicer, like the living spaces, like walking outside, like the cities are just super nice. And
Mm-hmm.
they are capitalist looking cities. They have designer brands, they have like whatever you want to buy, if you're into that as your identifying with freedom. They have those things. You can buy whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
And the parks are beautiful, and all of this, but also people started to talk about what they were paying at the grocery store compared to what they make,
Mm-hmm.
what they're paying for rent. And people started to get really pissed in the United States because they're like, wait a minute, a way bigger chunk of my salary is going to just basic living costs. And even then, a lot of people are going into the negative. Whereas China, the average Chinese person is able to pay for these basic living costs at a much smaller percentage of the salary that they earn. They actually have more free salary to be a consumer. Ironically, in America's, consumer-based society. So again, people can check that out on YouTube, looking up, Red Note, Americans react to Red Note. So yeah. Then, this series, which maybe we want to split up our
Yeah.
discussions into three parts because it's going to be, I think, long at this point. But the series is focusing on Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland. So part one is largely on Venezuela and also talking a little bit about Europe and the Russia's shadow fleet situation and how America is concocting its plan to address this. And then part two is on Greenland and critical minerals situation and how the US is planning on reacting to this. And then the third part, which I haven't yet published on my Substack, is going to be focused on Iran and also the implications of a possible hyperinflation hitting the US sooner than later, based off of the decisions that the foolish decisions that they have been making since Trump came into office. Not that the situation was already really bad, but he's doing a lot to exacerbate it and accelerate a really big crisis scenario. So for Venezuela, Maduro was kidnapped in early January, and Trump, I haven't really heard anything about the drug cartel situation in Venezuela. I do know that it has come out by the DOJ that they have acknowledged that they were accusing Maduro of being the head of a drug cartel that, in fact, does not exist. And people can go onto my Substack if you want to know more about that. Also, you can look at these articles here for how the CIA.
Don't brush over that. Just to be, not to go too much into that, but still don't brush over that. It's too big. You're saying that we went into Venezuela entirely based upon the idea that Maduro was the head of a narco cartel terrorist group that's killing Americans by infusing fentanyl and drugs. Huh?
The Sun Cartel, or the Cartel of the Sun, as in sun in the sky. And that this fake cartel that does not exist, the DOJ has now acknowledged does not exist, had been put on a terrorist list by the Trump administration. And so going in to capture Maduro by US Special Forces, they justified this by, not just that he was the head of a drug cartel, but a terrorist drug cartel. And thus, this was a matter of security for the United States and the Venezuelan people. Turns out the cartel doesn't exist, so obviously it cannot be implicated in acts of terrorism. And there is a long history of the CIA and US Special Forces actually being part of the big significant drug trafficking. Actually, ironically, this fake cartel was a slang term that was used to kind of just, basically the slang term started in the early 1990s when it was found out that the CIA was using certain corridors within the Venezuelan National Guard to traffic Colombian cocaine to the US streets, to the streets of the United States. The CIA was the head of this operation.
So Colombia cocaine
concocted this plan.
Yeah. So Colombia cocaine was moving from Colombia into Venezuela.
Well, through the Venezuelan National Guard to, I guess, I don't know the details, but I guess Miami, I think.
Yeah.
And then from Miami, the CIA took over. And 60 Minutes did an expose on this that won them the Pulitzer Prize back in the mid-90s, exposing the CIA's hand in this operation. The CIA is the brainchild. It's, like how you did that paper, Matt, on the FBI is basically the cause of all of domestic terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
The CIA also pretty much has its hand in all of the significant drug trafficking issues that we've had with Latin America. And this paper, especially, CIA, NATO, how Miami became the center of international fascism and the murder of President Kennedy. That's actually a chapter from my book, The Empire in Which the Black Sun Never Set. But this chapter is available for free on my Substack. And
that's a great read. That's a mind-blowing study. Sorry, I don't mean to. Yeah, I didn't mean to detract too much, but that people should
Oh, that's
read,
fine.
yeah, read that
No, interrupt me
article.
as much as you want because
Okay.
like I might, I probably am doing information overload.
Well, that's fine. I mean, the one you have below it too, the CIA's complicity in Mexican drug cartels, including military training at Fort Bragg. I have to reread that. It's been 2 years, and that especially with what's going on right now with the U.S. Special Forces being sent all over the Americas
Yeah.
as part of, yeah. I
It's
mean, there's definitely a new
it's
policy for the
Green
Americas.
Berets, Fort Bragg. And I just want to, this is from Paul Williams' book, Operation Gladio.
Hmm.
Um, who this is an excerpt from his book. So yeah, a very good read as well to just showcase, like, if you look at a lot of these really well-known writers from the 80s and 90s, and even into the 2000s, he was very very well understood that the CIA was implicated in these things. And now it's like, I don't know what's going on. Like, people don't have a memory, or they think that these things have just somehow magically disappeared. Because Trump was supposed to clean up the CIA and the FBI, but I haven't seen any evidence that the cleanup happened. And the CIA and the US Special Forces have still stations and networks all over Latin America. Like, these things didn't go away. Anyway, if people want to know more, they can just search the word Panama on my Substack, and you'll also get other information. But I think I'm going to be overloading people with information if I continue on that sideline. So yeah, Trump, when Maduro is captured, charged, and they admit that he's not actually the head of this drug cartel that doesn't exist, but we're still going to try him anyway in US courts, and we're not going to allow you to pay for your lawyer fees, by the way. But then Trump goes on and he gives a tour of CEOs of big oil to Venezuela. So we see where the priorities are at here very clearly, because again, China, it was buying 90% of Venezuelan oil. So Trump was hoping that he was going to be able to continue to sell this Venezuelan oil at the price he wanted, but in US dollars, not in renminbi. Again, as a very desperate way to try to offset the crisis, the collapse of the US petrodollar. When they came to Venezuela, they found out that the oil infrastructure was not very good. By the way, Venezuela has been a heavily sanctioned country from Chavez to Maduro. These are real consequences. Sanctions exist for that reason. It's economic decimation of a country to isolate them from global trade. I guess they realized that they couldn't quite do it exactly like that with China, so they tried this weird 2025 tariff situation. That's also why Russia is exempt from the 2025 tariffs, because they're already sanctioned like up the wazoo anyway. So it's not like they were given a free ride, as Trump likes to make it sound.
Mm-hmm.
So he gives these CEOs a tour of these CEOs of big oil, a tour of Venezuela, and it turns out there's apparently the estimate of $10 billion a year for the next 10 years. So $100 billion to build up the Venezuelan crude oil infrastructure to a place that would, be the place that they would, I think, feel that they were really benefiting from it. So this is a huge price check. Apparently, the CEOs of big oil were not impressed. So it shows that there was not a full communication, first of all, that Trump had with these big, oil CEOs, and that he didn't do a very competent feasibility study. So even ExxonMobil, which is, I think, the biggest of all of the big oil, told Trump it's uninvestable. And one of the reasons for this is also because you cannot ensure that it's going to stay within American hands. And Venezuela already as well, like they've said to China, do not pay attention to the United States. We're going to honor our deal, because Venezuela actually is paying China back for already investment that has already happened for Venezuelan infrastructure with their crude oil. Like, China doesn't need to buy the oil. Venezuela owes China money and they're paying it back through
Yes.
discounts on their crude
You
oil.
made that point. It was like a $60 billion investment that China made 20 years ago for an oil for infrastructure deal. And it was agreed upon that, yeah, China will build the infrastructure, which they honored. And in exchange, Venezuela will provide discounted oil.
Mm-hmm.
So to hear people screaming about the injustice of China and look, it's evidence of China being a dishonest player on the world stage and why we can't trust China. It's like, well, no, that's actually a perfectly reasonable way of doing business
Yeah.
completely.
And by the way, Canada was giving a 20% discount to the United States with our oil, and that apparently was fine. And Trump asks for these things in a very heavy-handed manner, but I guess it's, it's not exploitation of the people when Trump asks, because it's always owed. It's always owed. So yeah, ExxonMobil was saying that they had already lost past investment into Venezuela because of, I guess, political instability situations and guerrilla attacks. And they were not interested. Plus the fact that, you needed to already invest quite a bit into it to make it even worthwhile. Also, people should realize that Venezuelan oil is the most expensive and challenging to refine. So a lot of countries in the world do not have the capability to even refine Venezuelan oil. And that's another thing people have to understand that China should be given credit for. They've invested a lot in their home base, which is something the United States should have been doing, to be able to process and refine a bunch of things from the energy sector, from the critical minerals sector, so that they can be self-reliant and really have what they need to support their manufacturing base, which is the heartbeat of your economy to provide for your people. So not very many countries can actually refine Venezuelan oil. So when Trump, acquired the Venezuelan oil and the Chinese are like, we're not interested in buying from you. And the US is already at 90% capacity for refining their own crude oil. So they cannot refine a more crude oil. So they had all of this unrefined crude oil from Venezuela that is now like rotting in storage tanks, from as far as I know, because most people don't want to buy it because they can't refine it. And China, the 90%, buyer of 90% of Venezuelan oil, said, yeah, you can keep it.
Mm-mm.
So now India has agreed that they might buy some of it. We will see, because India is playing a bit of a game as well. And
Well,
Trump
they also said in words that when they were told stop buying Russian oil, they were
yeah.
like, yeah, maybe. And then they went back home and they gave an official announcement saying we're not going to be told who we can or cannot buy our oil from, indicating that they were being polite to deal with these threats, but they didn't really intend ever on following through on the submission.
Yeah.
At least on the issue of the Russian oil. What do you got there?
Well, that's Modi meeting Trump, right? When Trump was announcing that Modi was going to stop buying Russian oil,
right,
and only buy oil from the United States and Venezuela. And then it turned out afterwards, the Indian government made an official announcement to their news that there's no such thing that's happening. They're gonna buy from whoever they want to buy from, is essentially the message. And as we're going to see, India actually buys a lot from Russia's shadow fleet of oil as well. Okay, yeah. Yeah. Another note too is that when Maduro was kidnapped, the UK froze again a country's assets. They had already done that with Europe. The G7 had done that with a lot of Russia's assets, which is not a great move if you want to try to earn trust from the global South and even other G7 members. So they seized Venezuelan gold in the Bank of England. The UK Foreign Secretary said they did this for democracy. And Germany actually has a lot of its gold stored in the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, and they are also actually starting to panic, which is
Mm.
interesting because they're a G7 country. They're supposed to be an ally, but increasingly, people can see like there is a diktat where countries are at gunpoint at this point, allies, like primary allies of the Western grouping, including Japan, are being told to do some like pretty big like donations of organs. Let's put it that way. And so Germany is getting very nervous because if you do anything that is going to upset the Anglo-American direction that they want, they're sheepdogging everybody towards. If you disagree with this, your assets are, they're put in a vulnerable situation. We don't even know, like Germany doesn't even know probably if their gold is actually in the Federal Reserve. And why would you pay, right, for your gold to be stored in the
In another
Federal
country.
Reserve when
Yeah.
you should be storing it in your own country? Again, just goes to show that countries like Germany are not in a very they're not in control of their country's policies, welfare, or
Well,
future.
they're a giant U.S. military base on the one hand. I mean, it's not just Ramstein; it's a major hub for the military industrial complex. But they were never allowed to become a real country after World War II anyway. And that's, I guess, some of the consequences also that the Japanese have begun to wake up to that, oh, we didn't actually, we forgot we were supposed to be a real country, and now we're paying the consequences of having permitted a foreign power to control our entire destiny as soon as we're meant to be disposable. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, and I mean, pretty ironic because these countries, especially Japan, is still a very proud country, but they don't seem to understand. They don't want to have any kind of slighting from China,
Mhm.
like the smallest thing. But the United States is asking you to pretty much bend over backwards and say thank you, and they seem to think that that's somehow not of a low status. Um, right. And this is just to showcase that the United States right now, what they did with Venezuela and what they attempted to do with Iran, although the last I heard, the first ships that were allowed to go through the Hormuz Strait were Chinese ships that Iran was continuing to let pass. So I don't even think there was that much of an issue with Chinese trade. The other side note to this, quickly, is that a lot of oil refineries were hit or shut down in these Gulf states. And that also creates a big issue because China has the biggest refining capacity, as I've already mentioned. The United States is already at maximum capacity at over 90%. So they can't even refine the Venezuelan crude right now. They have to sell it as crude, not unrefined crude. And Canada does not have any ability. We sell our oil for the United States to refine because we're a colony. And so there are increasingly less places to refine oil. So even though you might have the oil ready to go and the traffic is happening, but if you cannot refine it,
You can't
you're
use it.
still going to have problems with gas prices and diesel and so forth. So it still is giving China a kind of a strategic advantage doing these kinds of things. A lot of these things are backfiring.
Right.
And they're just very impatient, very brutish, forceful tactics that they're clearly not being very well thought through. Europe, I'm going to just go through it, I think, quickly. People should be reminded that Nord Stream was blown up by the Americans. And if you didn't know that, you can read Seymour Hersh's paper. But, because of the Russian energy, basically, it's pretty much only coming through the Turk Stream, but in like much smaller percentage than what it was originally before the whole Ukraine fiasco. Europe is now, and they've very much, atrophied their energy sector of their own volition. And now they're stuck buying dirty energy that is super expensive from the United States, just as the United States wanted it to be. So, people have to think about like how any of this makes any sense if you actually want to increase the welfare or sovereignty of your country, no matter where you are. America wants to increase its LNG. So you can see America is really gunning to have the control over global energy supply. And this is no joke. It's very serious. Of course, whoever controls the energy allocation is going to control the living standard of a people. This is Seymour Hersh's paper that goes through in detail, a very well-respected old veteran journalist from back in the day who did a good report on the Americans being responsible for the Nord Stream bombing. I'm going to just go over this quickly, but Ukraine right now is causing problems too with some of this Russian energy going through, and it's affecting, not just Slovakia and Hungary, but it's affecting Europe as well. But the fact is that the EU is also, from what I understand, it's put through, and it has begun. They have put through legislation where they're going to phase out Russian gas and oil imports, such that there will be no more short-term contracts as of June 17th, and long-term contracts will be banned from January 1st, 2028. So these are contracts that already
because
exist.
Right now they're still getting Russian gas indirectly through both the pipelines that you just pointed out, right? The Druzhba pipelines that involve going through Ukraine, but then also, yeah, there you go, into Slovakia and Hungary, which is a point that these are very, and also one through Poland, right? There's that upper northern extension through Poland. But all of these are very volatile. They could easily be shut down, especially by the Ukrainians who
Well,
are.
the Ukrainians did shut down
Right.
they said it was a drone, and apparently there was another drone attack just this past August. So yeah.
Right. Right. So you have that type of it, but you could still get around not having the Nord Stream 1 or 2 through Turkey, right? As far as I understand it, that's the only other option from Russian gas into Europe via Turkey.
Yeah, the Turk Stream.
The Turk Stream and the Blue Stream,
the Ukraine Transit, which transports oil and gas.
Okay.
So Ukraine Transit has multiple lines, and it includes oil and gas. Turk Stream is just gas, from my understanding. And then this is, I guess, LNG from the United States. Traversing incredible distances to save Europe. At a really high expense.
I heard it was 4 times more expensive to buy the U.S. LNG than it was the Russian.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, the Germans never even made the decision on Nord Stream, right? It had to be blown up. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that should really give you an idea of like what is going on here. It's a lot more than just, sanctioning or boycotting Russian energy. Like, this has serious consequences to the standard of living of your own people.
And most Germans know this. I mean, that's the disgusting thing, is that so many German citizens are aware, many Europeans are very aware that what they've been told about who caused Nord Stream to blow up, they've been told it's the Russians. Most of them don't believe it. But despite that, the political class is so chicken and so, like, they got hands of the city of London and Wall Street deeply embedded up their nether regions that they won't say
intelligence agencies too.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's true, right? The Angela Merkel even got pissed at a certain point because she was being surveilled by the CIA, and her communications were all being followed, and had to even shut down the CIA bureau for like 2 seconds in Berlin, or at least chastise them, right?
Well, yeah, and like the energy minister, there were some crazy things happening. I think when Merkel was still in charge, but like at the very end, the energy minister had signed a deal with China on hydrocarbons like a month or two before Biden came into office. And Biden's like, how dare you sign this deal before my inauguration? And this energy minister had gone to a party and he started to have like an anaphylactic reaction, and he doesn't have an allergy or anything. He had to be rushed to the hospital. Maybe it wasn't a full anaphylactic, it was possibly a form of poisoning, but still caused his airway to close, and he survived. Another minister that Merkel had selected to deal with China, who was stationed, I think, I forgot exactly where now, but he died within like 1 or 2 weeks of being stationed there. So there was and they had another minister. I forgot now what position he was in during COVID, who was also killed.
I think
A
he was the
German minister.
transport. Wasn't he the transport minister who got like run over by a train or something?
No,
Or
no, no.
no?
He was put on a rail, a train
Yeah, that's
rail.
what I'm saying. He was put
Oh, you
on
said
a
train?
yes,
Sorry,
in a train. Yeah,
I don't know why I heard bus. Um, yeah, a train. He was run over by a train, and they said he had committed suicide.
right. Because he was trying to sign a deal with China on some massive infrastructure deal or something like that. I vaguely remember these things, but it's been so long since I looked into it.
And they said, yeah, he died because he couldn't handle the pressure from COVID,
Right.
politically or something. So there's been a number of like German, people of political positions that have been killed.
Right.
And that's just from me not paying too close attention, right? Like I just happened to stumble upon. I didn't go looking for those names, so there's probably a lot more. But yeah, so in 2025, EU imported 4.48 billion euros in Russian LNG, a crazy increase of 3.47 billion euros, which I find really hard to believe. But this is coming from DPA. Is that
I don't know. I mean, if they show up on Yahoo
anyway?
News,
Yeah,
they're probably not. They're probably mainstream.
yeah. DPA News. Deutsch.
Presse Argento. Okay, yeah, it's the biggest press agency of Germany. Yes.
So yeah, they're a Western news agency. So yeah, that's insane.
Mhm.
And so they're trying to phase this out. And the only plan that I'm aware of that they are thinking of to replace this is with the American LNG, which again, if you don't diversify, if we have learned a lesson from the 2025 tariffs, if you're not an American country, you should diversify if you don't want a gun held to your head.
Yeah.
And yet, Europe is doing the exact opposite for something as important as energy reliance. So,
Mhm.
not a great move.
Nope.
Um, this is just talking about how Qatar's LNG, which was also supposed to be helping European energy needs, that was shut down after the Iran war. So I don't know what the deal is now. I don't think it's been turned on again. Like it usually takes months anyway for something like that to get back online, from my understanding. And this is just to give people a summary of what has been shut down as energy to Europe. And we pretty much just have the Turk Stream and Blue Stream, which might, have an attack on them, and we're going to have the blame game of who did it. I
Well,
think.
that's according to Russian intelligence. They already put out the warning saying that they've got information that indicates that a plan to blow those up has been underway now for several weeks. That
Mhm.
ties Kiev and British intelligence into the plot. So it's definitely on the Russian radar that might be taken out.
Yeah, and the fact that we know that Nord Stream was American with other
So
European participation, and the
yeah,
fact that Ukraine, I think, is pretty much admitted in most Western press that they did do a drone attack on the pipelines to Slovakia and Hungary, who
Right.
are now in a position, I think they took Croatia to court because Croatia was trying to charge them 3 times the price. So
Right.
again, what they're trying to do clearly is make energy more expensive. So the people who can afford it will have it. The people who can't afford it will not have it.
Mhm.
And that actually goes along very much to a theme that we did as a film by Rising Tide called Energy Wars that people can watch on our Rising Tide YouTube page or just go on either of our Substacks and search Energy Wars. So I'm gonna just kind of wrap it up at
So
this
just quick,
point.
what do they want to just kill the Europeans? Like, what do they want to do? Is this just what do you think is the
It's a
strategy here with the
depopulation.
shutting down of oil?
I
And
think
that,
there's a clear depopulation energy agenda by making energy scarce, but it's also a way to control what countries do. It's the lifeline of a
right.
country.
Mhm.
So it's like depriving air to a
Yeah,
person.
right.
Um, so this is images of Russia's shadow fleet, which is a pretty badass name for ships that are trading in sanctioned Russian oil. As you can see from the graph, China and India are the biggest purchasers of this, but you also have Turkey, Singapore, Bulgaria, UAE, Brazil, South Korea, and even the Netherlands.
Hmm.
And they've been increasing, especially in the Arctic Ocean, which brings up the whole USA's interest in Greenland for controlling trade routes. And again, this battle over whether affordable energy can actually be delivered to countries, including other forms of supply chain, critical material. But energy, of course, is one of the most important ones. This is just a graph showcasing how much Europe is paying more for its energy. That this attempt to try to hurt Russia has backfired because they have China as a large purchaser, but also very good with their shadow fleet. So even with the blowing up of these pipelines, the shadow fleet is delivering the oil to whoever wants to buy it. So again, there is back to the BlackRock significance. There needs to be control over the supply chain corridors through the maritime corridors because like rail and pipelines are very susceptible to terrorist attacks. It's much harder to control maritime corridors through terrorist attacks. So they want to try to control it through controlling geographical trade chokeholds. So
Mhm.
Panama is one of them. The Greenland area of both the Northwest Passage and the Transpolar Sea route is a trade chokehold, and also the Hormuz Strait is a trade chokehold. So they want to, focus on these sorts of areas. Actually, around Cuba is also a form of a trade chokehold.
Right.
And that was another reason too why now Trump wants to target Chinese-made container ships. So China is the number one builder of container ships. So companies who are trading and delivering this trade by ship, China is pretty much the top producer, although you also have a lot of other Asian countries, Japan and South Korea are the other top ones. But in terms of trade that's happening, they're mostly Chinese container ships that are being bought from companies that are European. For instance, here we have German, what is it? German, South Korean, Danish, Singaporean, Israeli, Taiwanese, large companies who are using Chinese container ships. And Trump wants to put a crazy tax on these vessels to penalize them for using a Chinese bought container ship. So has nothing to do with Chinese trade, has nothing to do with the Chinese government
Yeah.
because the US wants to start dominating in
Yeah.
shipbuilding and they
Yeah.
don't
No,
like
it's
it. people will be buying Chinese ships instead of American ships.
What a joke, eh? That really annoys me. Like, and we're always hearing that China doesn't play fair and all this stuff, and it's like, no, actually, this is not playing fair to an extreme degree where you're going to intervene. Like, this is not competition. You're basically punishing everybody. What does it say there? You said $1 million per vessel is what you written down there as punishment.
Yeah, 1.5 million, or based on the percentage that that company has of Chinese built vessels.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So it could be up to 1 million per vessel entering a US port. Which obviously is a crazy amount, and that's going to clearly backfire because a lot of these companies are like, well, then we won't trade with you. Because again, East Asia, for instance, is a huge growing consumer base.
And does the US have the production of these cargo ships that they're already doing such that they could sell to these companies and countries abroad to compensate for them not using Chinese container ships?
No, and the statistic right now is that for every 359 large container ships China makes, the US produces one each year.
Wow.
So they don't even have the capability, nowhere near the capability to compete with China on this. And that's the other reason why they want these ports, right? Because obviously this would backfire if it was just American ports on American territory doing this. But if theoretically you owned all of the strategic ports everywhere in the world, just think like a crazy person for a moment, then you could decide the taxes that you would choose to do on whoever you chose to do them at the whim. And you can also even start thinking about seizing any cargo that you wish to seize, back in the day of pirates and empires. So this is the agenda, and I proved this further in my part 2 of this series. And it's like the game of Monopoly, where you are hoping that a Chinese ship lands on your port, and then you can collect in your imagination. Again, like the 2025 tariffs showed that China just walked away, but they want to continue fantasizing in their dream world that China will be forced to trade with them. They'll get $1 million per ship, which if you do this for, 1,000 Chinese ships docking at a US controlled port anywhere in the world, you can earn $1 billion to give to your US military. Is the dream. Of course, I don't think it will work out that way, but yeah, I think we should probably end it here. And this is the Eye of the Storm Energy Wars. People can watch it for free on our Rising Tide YouTube channel.
Yeah, I think we're not going to do part 2 today. But I think you gave people a lot to chew on. I do hope that this complements people's the audience's desire to go and read your work and subscribe, upgrade to the paid subscription too, that gets you even more access to Cynthia Chung's mind and discoveries that she shares on a regular basis, including these free documentaries that are usually put out every so often. It takes a lot of work for us to make them, and your series on escaping Calypso's Island is fantastic. So I encourage people to check those out too, or go to the link in the description box for more of those videos. Cynthia, it's been a wild ride. Thank you so much for elucidating and clarifying a lot of chaos and a lot of smokescreen that's been put around basic elementary facts that we should all be allowed to look at with sober, objective eyes. Thank you so much. And we'll do this again. We're going to meet back in a few days and go through part 2 and maybe even part 3. Who knows? Thank you.
Thank you.
Beyond Geopolitics is brought to you by the Rising Tide Foundation, with the goal of promoting deep structure analysis of the world with a look towards natural law and breaking free of zero-sum thinking. Thank you for watching and supporting this work.